Good evening. Welcome to Is Something Amazing or Terrible About to Happen? AI Today, an informative presentation from knowledgeable faculty within a variety of different departments throughout campus. My name is Coretta Harris, and I am the president of Women in Philanthropy at UCLA. I'm a proud supporter of the School of Engineering and also the women's softball team. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge one of our board members that lost her fight with cancer on Thanksgiving Day. Dr. Karen Ito, a strong supporter of the anthropology department, would certainly be on this webinar had she not lost her fight. Please remember Dr. Ito's family as we move through the holiday season. Thank you. Women in Philanthropy at UCLA celebrates and inspires women's giving across the UCLA campus and fosters women's participation on campus boards and volunteer leadership positions. The group will celebrate its 30th anniversary in 2024. It now boasts over 3,100 members who contribute time, talent, and treasure to every corner of the university. These extraordinary women leaders have roles on many of the advisory leadership groups at UCLA and also hold positions within the UCLA Foundation. To engage the UCLA community, we hold events throughout the year that showcase different areas or topics across campus. For these larger scale programs, we're focusing on webinars to allow UCLA supporters from across the country to participate as we showcase different aspects of UCLA's programs, faculty, research, and innovation. Today's presentation should be very enlightening and informative. We are on the cusp of potentially incredible transformations with the expansion and exponential improvement progress of artificial intelligence. Will the impact be positive, negative, or a bit of both? AI makes it possible for machines to learn from experience, adjust to new inputs, and perform human-like tasks. However, things are moving faster than we can understand them. How do we deal with social change that's happening so quickly and pervasively? Today, we have convened a panel of faculty experts from across campus who will share their thoughts about benefits and challenges of AI for individuals, communities, and the world at large. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jens Paulsberg, who will announce the panelists. Dr. Paulsberg joined the Henry Samueli School of Engineering and Applied Science in 2003 as professor of computer science from Purdue University. He served as the chair of the computer science department from 2010 to 2015 and received the Eon Instrumentation Incorporated Excellence in Teaching Award in April of this year. Dr. Paulsberg earned a master's in computer science and mathematics from the University of Aarhus in Denmark, where he also earned a PhD in computer science. In 2020, he was elected to the executive committee of the Association for Computing Machinery, which is the main society in computing. Dr. Paulsberg is now the faculty director of the Science Hub for Humanity and Artificial Intelligence, a collaboration between UCLA and Amazon launched in 2021. His research interests include programming languages, software engineering, and quantum computing. This all makes him the ideal person to facilitate the discussion with the panelists. The panelists will share more information about their research and experiences and then answer questions from Dr. Paulsberg. There will be time after the conversation for the panelists to answer questions from the audience. So please submit them through the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. They will be reviewed and consolidated by staff, and Dr. Paulsberg will present them to our panelists for their response. The panelists have reviewed the attendees' pre-submitted questions and they are incorporated into the questions. At this time, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Dr. Jens Paulberg. Thank you, Dr. Paulsberg.
And I want to just say these are amazing people. They have contributed a lot to the field of AI. They have thought a lot about the impact on AI on us, on society, and it's just wonderful to have them here. I want to say a few words about every one of them and then let them just talk a little bit about themselves before we get to the questions. We have Jeff Burke. He is the Associate Dean for Research and Technology in the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. We have Jacob Foster. He is a professor of sociology, and he is a co-director of the Diverse Intelligence Summer Institute, and he's also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. We have Sophia Noble. She is director of the Center on Race and Digital Justice, and along with being a professor at UCLA, she is the David O. Sears Presidential Endowed Chair in the Division of Social Sciences. We have Sarah Roberts. She is director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, and she is a professor of gender studies, information studies, and labor studies. And then finally, we have Danny Snelson. He is a professor of English and Design Media Arts. And so everybody, I just want to hear a bit more about what are you doing with AI and what are you excited about? And if you like, say where you were born. And so Jeff, can we start with you?
Sounds good, thanks. So I was born in Fullerton, California. I'm not that far away. So I co-direct the Center for Research in Engineering, Media and Performance, or REMAP, at UCLA, and this is a joint center between theater, film, and television in the School of Engineering. And we look at a variety of different kinds of emerging technologies and both their role in creativity, but also community development and in other fields as well. We involve students from a lot of different disciplines in hands-on projects. And with respect to AI, my research interests and what we've been doing at REMAP often look at how they can be applied in live experiences in particular. So we look at how artists can be involved in both developing technologies and then applying them. And so in the live context, AI, I think for me is interesting in how it can allow creative adjustments that happen on the fly and do things that are sort of more sophisticated than we can easily code ourselves or design ourselves. And so take a human author or an ensemble's guidance and expand worlds that might otherwise be difficult to create with traditional techniques. And so balance things like having an audience participate, but within a story that has been kind of authored in a linear way by a human being. So we do everything from experimentation with language models and large language models to weave generated and pre-written dialogue together in real time for actors in ways that are specific to particular theatrical projects, to applications that are in a completely different domain, looking at machine learning based computer vision to sense the position of people and objects and use that to drive media experiences. So for example, to let kids play within science learning simulations using their body rather than a mouse or a keyboard and support embodied learning in science. And so these are some of the types of things that we're looking at that are quite diverse across technologies and fields for right now. I think we'll come back to questions of access and bias that exist in AI systems and that are quite relevant and concerns for this type of work, because artists often work in very specific cultural contexts, but also with small data rather than big data. So looking forward to talking about that a bit. I'll pass it to Jacob for the next introduction.
Hello. So I was born in West Virginia, just across the border from the little town in Virginia where I grew up, a place called Winchester. So I'm so pleased to be speaking to all of you. As Jens mentioned, I'm a professor of sociology, but I come from a physics and complex systems background and teach technical courses on machine learning and deep learning for social scientists. So my work really ranges across the disciplinary spectrum from more humanistic to really mathematical and computational scholarship. So one way I look at AI is from the perspective of the sociology of science. For example, I've studied one of the key practices behind contemporary AI, something called benchmarking, where researchers compare their algorithms against each other on special benchmark data sets. With my student Bernie Koch and collaborators Alex Hanna and Remy Denton, who were then both at Google AI Ethics, we conducted the first ever comprehensive study of benchmarking, finding that benchmark data sets really receive highly unequal levels of attention and use. And then the majority of usages depend on data sets that are produced by a handful of powerful companies and universities. And that paper, we were really happy that it was received warmly by the ML community and actually got a Best Paper Award at NeurIPS, which is one of the top AI conferences. I also look at AI from a more social theory perspective, trying to understand how the technical ideas and the research practices in contemporary AI, specifically those around deep learning, have a kind of bias towards promoting social arrangements that can be corrosive to human flourishing, and then try to think about how we might need to change the foundations of AI, as well as the foundations of social theory, to imagine better possible social worlds. And I just had a paper come out in the journal Public Culture on what I call the politics of human compatible AI. Finally, I come to it as someone who develops new machine learning methods and thinks about the foundations of artificial intelligence. So I've created new approaches to computational text analysis that work better and more reliably on small scale data sets like we use in the social sciences or the humanities or public health. I've studied the behavior of groups of AI agents. I'm currently leading a big project to develop new approaches to AI that are based on kind of more complex systems or collective intelligence perspectives. I'm also really happy to share with you all that with me as the lead organizer, the Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics, which is on our campus, will be hosting a semester-long program next fall on the mathematics of intelligences, which will explore the theory of deep learning, naturalistic approaches to AI, lots of other cool related topics, and we'll have some public lectures, which I hope you all will come to. So next up, I would like to hand it over to Sophia.
Hi, thanks so much, Jacob. It's great to be here with all of you tonight. I guess, connection to this work and thinking about AI started, I don't know, over a decade ago, coming out of industry. I was working in the ad industry and really in the kind of early days of ad tech, and thinking about what it means that all of our information needs are increasingly organized by large-scale global advertising platforms. And really, this is probably one of the more boring dimensions of AI, which is the banal, everyday ways that people interact with AI without even really knowing it. And so I am an expert on search engines. I think about everyday technologies like that, and what the broader social and political implications and economic implications of those kinds of everyday technologies or everyday kinds of AI are for the public, for eroding our civil and human rights, for encroaching upon our, our eroding sense of privacy or privacy rights. And, more broadly, I would say both in my work, I've been a longtime collaborator with Professor Roberts here, but also, I think of her work and mine as part of a small community of women who have been at the forefront of talking about the social implications of AI algorithms and the tech industry writ large on completely remaking societies around the world. And so I wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression, which is a best-selling book that really complicates and is brought into stark relief the idea that AI and algorithms and machine learning are not simply math, which is really, I think, prior to the research that people like us were doing, was the hyper-reductionist way in which people talked about these types of technologies. But in fact, these are wholly human endeavors that reflect the politics and interests of a variety of different kinds of human beings, especially people in power. And there are a number of human beings who are involved in every step of what we think of as artificial intelligence. And so I think of my work as kind of unmasking the broader implications of AI in society. And of course, that has been possible by foregrounding all of the ways in which vulnerable people, communities of color, poor people, working people, women, and children around the world have been experimented upon, quite frankly, in the development of a variety of different kinds of dangerous technologies. So I think with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Roberts.
Thank you, Professor Noble. Thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be here among some of my very favorite UCLA colleagues and with this assembled group today. I'll pick up where Dr. Noble left off by saying that my entry point into the conversations about AI have a lot to do with precision in our language around how we describe AI and its functions and its capacities, discussing what it's actually doing versus what the claims are around what it does and how it does it. And this really comes from a place of both my own personal history as a tech worker, starting in the early 90s, and then also as someone who was very interested in the working conditions of people who were doing a type of work that was entirely generated and predicated upon the existence of new forms of communication systems that in the early to mid 2000s we were calling social media platforms, things like Facebook and other connectivity tools, as well as just the growth in general and the commercialization and adoption of the World Wide Web, which started in the mid 90s and really was coinciding at that time with the rise of social media. My interest back about almost a decade and a half ago was piqued by learning that there were a group of workers in rural Iowa who were fairly low wage, low status workers working in a call center like environment. And this was a part of the country, if you're familiar with that part of the country, by the way, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin originally, so I am familiar with that part of the country. This was an area that had at one time been the site of many family farms. And if you're old enough to remember Farm Aid in the 80s, this was the site of Farm Aid. This is where Willie Nelson and the guy that we used to call Johnny Cougar Mellencamp would go to try to keep people in their farms. That was largely an unsuccessful effort. Iowa has pretty much given over its agriculture to agribusiness, and the people that used to work the land there needed to find new occupations. Well, back in about 2010, one of the occupations that people were doing was working in these third-party call centers to take material that was being uploaded to these new sites, such as Facebook and Friendster and other MySpace, and really not really a concern anymore, but sort of at its peak at that time. And they were making decisions about whether or not the material that was being submitted was suitable for the sites for which they were intended. This was also screening that they were doing for commercial websites, places like REI and so on. At the time, what's interesting about this phenomenon, when it first became known, it was largely unknown, was that many people assumed that computers were making these decisions. How would computers have been making those decisions? Well, they would have been doing so through artificial intelligence processes. Now, back in 2010, I can tell you that the capacity for computers to look at, recognize, and then apply essentially a flow chart, a decision-making tree to visual material, never mind video or audio, was pretty much nil. Like, you needed supercomputer power to really do that reliably. I was at the University of Illinois at the time, and the National Center for Supercomputing Applications was a place where they were trying to help computers reliably know that a table was a table, a static object in a virtual reality cube was a table. And so what's interesting about where I come from in AI is that a lot of my work has gone to dismantling myths about the capacities and the potential for some of these tools, as if they can be divorced from the human. You may know Amazon Mechanical Turk, based on an 18th century simulation of a chess playing automaton that was actually controlled by a person inside a cabinet. So a lot of the work that I do, it has to do with identifying where the human traces are absolutely central to what we think of as computational solutions, and trying to foreground that humanity in those processes, if for no other reason than to recognize that the primacy of machines is largely something that's taken on dimensions of religiosity, and it certainly has done that in Silicon Valley. It's about separating the hype from reality, and it's also, as Safia said, and some of my other colleagues have said and will say, about identifying harms and applications that make sense and applications that actually don't make sense for the broader social good. And one of the questions that I think we're all asking on this panel is, who stands to benefit? The corollary to that question is, who stands to be harmed? And I will pass the mic to my colleague, Danny Snelson.
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, I just want to jump into conversation with everyone already. I'm so honored to be here. I was raised in rural northern Utah, a tiny little town called Roy, and happy to be here at UCLA, where I should add, I also work with the Digital Humanities Program, the Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies, and the Game Lab. My research in AI stems from this ongoing project that I've termed the Little Database. Over the past decade, I've been trying to work on this problem of how to read like all of the stuff that fills up our hard drives. Anyone, scholars especially among us, who has downloaded like over 1,000 PDF files knows that we have these collections that are incredibly idiosyncratic. They are at once too big to read all at once, and they're too little and too weird for big data analytics or analytics of any sense. So throughout, I've just been really interested in everyday, ordinary media, questions of scale, and how literary interpretation and creativity, especially poetry and poetics actually, might reveal hidden vectors in some of our rapidly changing technological environments. So in this work, I approach this topic from a few different vantages. I work as a digital archivist, where I preserve and digitize historical works of art and literature. I work as a scholar, where I write about these new media objects. Most of the stuff I've digitized, I also try to write about. And then as a poet, where I use these things to create new creative objects. My background is in experimental poetry in the traditions of the historical avant-gardes. And at a certain point doing this research, I realized that the formal play and the aesthetic invention that drew me to this study had actually moved into internet culture and its emergent genres like memes, comics, games, and VR. It felt like these were the spaces where really interesting formal invention was happening. So given all these interests, namely being extremely online, nothing over the past decade has been more transformative for me than algorithms and generative AI. So currently, I'm teaching this new undergraduate course called Algo Lit, an introduction to AI literature. It was featured today, serendipitously, in the UCLA newsroom. But in this class, we play with new AI tools in order to develop better understandings for critical perspectives on emerging algorithms. The course I'm adapting, I have the same course number. I'm adapting the course from my esteemed colleague emeritus, Kate Hales, who introduced E-Lit as a genre of literature to UCLA in the mid-90s. And now, of course, she was thinking about electronic literature. But now, it's difficult to find any literature that's not electronic, right? Like this has become ubiquitous and pervasive. So in my new AlgoLit curriculum, I'm trying to update this model to instead think about forms of generative writing, algorithmic production that are interrogating these new technological systems, arguing that throughout that the role of literature and the arts might surface some otherwise unseen aspects, biases, shortcomings, ultimately algorithmic harms that these systems produce. Beyond the classroom and my own creative practice, I'll just say briefly that I'm working on an elaborate AI forgery of an experimental poetry magazine from the 70s, as well as a set of mourning songs for algorithmic harms that I'm calling artificial hymns I guess you can take the boy out of Utah, but you can't take the Utah out of the boy or something. I'd be happy to talk about any of that at length at any point, but most of all, I'm just honored to be here in conversation with you all.
Thank you, everybody. That is wonderful to be here. And I have some questions that I thought about, and have questions that people submitted ahead of time. And I'm going to ask you some questions based on that. So let me begin with a question for you, Jeff. So just tell me what intrigues you about AI, and what got you into doing research on this.
Thanks. I think I alluded to it a little bit already, that my interest in live performance in particular was to create physical spaces in which the media, so lights, sound, video, computer graphics, are responsive to human action in a meaningful way. And so I started sort of a shift from training in electrical engineering to kind of thinking about theater and media artwork around 20 years ago, and that was kind of a key part. And this idea of maybe turning a stage environment into an instrument that can be played by an ensemble and so on. And there are a lot of people doing that type of work. And in graduate school about 20 years ago, it was sort of clear to me, even at that time, though I was not really working with machine learning, at least not in the form we think about it today, that teaching machines by example to create relationships between, in this case, people and media, rather than trying to program them in a classical way, was maybe more practical, felt more appropriate for the idea of rehearsal and creative processes that are iterative. And so this interest was sort of sparked in how to apply learning techniques to these responsive environments. And sort of a while later, when machine learning based computer vision, so the ability to kind of sense and make sense of visual data from cameras in a space became, more accessible. I started applying that in systems like the one that I mentioned in the introduction, that we're looking at educational environments and performance environments and so on. And so that was sort of the thing that intrigued me, which is pretty far in some sense from LLMs and what's generating a lot of the public activity around AI right now, but connected maybe at a more fundamental level that we'll talk about later. The first part, I think, was what intrigues me now. And I think the most interesting thing that I've mentioned to you before is the idea of LLMs, large language models, and kind of contemporary AI helping people make software and in a way, or for folks where it was not really accessible before. And so this idea of sort of opening up a new realm of creativity that's not really about, generating new copies of things or new instances of things, although there's lots to talk about there, but is really kind of helping artists engage with software development at a kind of substantial scale, the kinds of things that we experience a lot of our media and entertainment through today that have really been out of reach. And I see lots of student ideas in classes when we think through and prototype artistic ideas for new technologies that ultimately hinge on being able to make code that implements this really original creative idea. And that ability to make software is kind of off limits. So the sort of positive and interesting thing for me is opportunities to open up software development. Lots of other things to talk about, but I'll kind of leave it at that.
Danny, can I ask you the same question? What intrigues you?
What intrigues me? Give me the question one more time.
What intrigues you about AI, really?
Oh, I mean, there's so much that intrigues me that it's hard to start. I think the more that I have been studying AI or thinking about it or teaching with it or playing with it, the more I realize what a pervasive change it's introducing into not just my field of study, literary and aesthetic forms, but culture more broadly, cultural industries as we've seen. Technical systems, educational, pedagogical systems, all of these things I think are subject to really dramatic transformations. And so, having worked on histories of aesthetic forms that try to engage with new technological media, my interests are really drawn to trying to think alongside peers of mine, poets and artists primarily, who are trying to engage with these systems to do what Marshall McLuhan would call a type of advanced probe, to try to get a sample of where we might be going, even if we don't quite know where that destination is yet.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a different question. What are you looking forward to on the positive side of advances in AI, and what are you concerned about? That's so a big positive and a big negative. So Jacob, what do you think?
Well, in terms of a big positive, one of the things I'm really excited about is the possibility of studying sort of alternate intelligences. So rather than being kind of bewitched by AI technologies or trying to shoehorn their capacities into kind of crude analogies with human capacities, as we do when we use freighted, language, like saying, do large language models understand X, Y, and Z? Instead, view these simply as other intelligences that we can study and understand. This is a perspective that a couple of my collaborators, Melanie Mitchell and David Krakauer, have advocated, and I think it's a really cool way to think about it. So let me give you a more concrete example. I'm sure many of you are familiar with large language models, or LLMs. We're going to spend a bunch of time talking about them tonight. But I think they're really exciting possibilities if you imagine, for example, scaling these models down so they're kind of lighter weight, they're more data efficient. As those reach a certain scale, I think that will open up lots of really exciting possibilities for folks who are interested in studying things like collective intelligence or language learning or language evolution and so forth. More broadly, I think that there's a real opportunity here to deepen our understanding of intelligence as a phenomenon, including thinking about the ways in which AI technologies work with and upon the outputs of human intelligence, as Sarah was talking about. So you view AI in the most positive construal as a sort of technology for human collaboration, following, for example, the way Jaron Lanier, who's a VR researcher and tech thinker I really admire, talks about it. I think on all of these questions, we're at the stage right now that they were when, folks knew how to build steam engines but didn't have thermodynamics. This is the image Jan LeCun often uses, and I think that's exactly right. So as someone who is interested in things like thermodynamics, I think they're very cool opportunities to really get a deeper understanding of intelligence. As for what I'm worried about, you'll hear very soon, I think, in fact, she already has done so, Sophia talk about a lot of the really awful and immediate harms of actually existing AI technology. And then there are the people who worry about these sort of fantasy scenarios of superhuman, whatever AI, that we can put those to one side. What I worry about is, what you might call a sort of middle range harm, in which the current path of AI development, deeply entangled with monopolistic capital, leads to all sorts of negative effects, like, destroying local, cultural, and social variability, reducing and simplifying societal or individual objectives, degrading people, cultures, environment, all those things that current AI technologies and the current paradigm kind of uses as fuel, and the further kind of sequestering away of things that should be topics of debate and political engagement behind a kind of curtain of black boxed technical expertise baked into AI algorithms. And, in the worst case scenario, I'm worried that this current path could get us into a world of massive and almost unbridgeable disparities of power that you don't need to buy into some singularitarian fever dream in order to be really worried about.
Mm-hmm. So you said LLMs, large language models. So apparently we have to cover this. So Danny, what is it?
As working on little data, I think I'm often called up to talk about large language. What are large language models? So I don't know. Here's how I describe it to my students. First, they're built on massive amounts of text. So you can think of hundreds of billions of words all cobbled together from the internet, places like Reddit, from news sources like Reuters, from pirate libraries, as we've seen, shadow libraries of books and articles by my esteemed peers here, among many others. And then they use this massive corpus of text, and they're built by applying neural networks and deep learning. The mechanisms of deep learning are kind of mysterious even to developers, but it's a side point, to create probabilistic relations among words, basically to predict how one word is going to follow the preceding one. Importantly, though, these statistical relations aren't just on one plane, they're multidimensional. And this is where I think people get tripped up, but it's actually kind of, it's kind of easy to understand if you think of the idea of the word cat, and like on one dimension, cat is very close to feline. In another dimension, cat is very close to like domesticity because it's like a domestic pet. In another dimension, it's very close to like, I don't know, some kind of like moody sovereign. Anyone who's lived with a cat knows like they're like they have like a mood. So like all these dimensions are mapped on together, which is part of what produces a large language model, but they're also now increasingly multimodal. So they can be mapped onto other media, images, code, sound, movies. All these things can be mapped into the same large language model set of dimensions and vectors. So they are, I think, has been aptly termed a kind of stochastic parrot. They return our words back to us using probabilistic computation. And so the last thing I'll say is that within these workings, large language models, the secret math of their deep learning, I think it's of the utmost importance to note, and hopefully, by understanding them a bit clearer to understand that they're really just mirroring and returning to us all of the biases and failings of these sources. All of the texts on the internet are reflected and even amplified, despite their safeguards, in the kind of generative outputs that we get. So when you asked me, I just asked ChatGPT what a large language model is, and it gave me a more succinct version than what I just said. It says, technically, LLMs are a type of neural network that excels in handling sequential data like language. They process text input by breaking it down into smaller pieces, understanding the context and relationships between these pieces, and then generating appropriate responses. So that's more or less a good answer, I think.
Very good. Okay. So we have that covered. And I think since ChatGPT came out a year ago, companies have sprung up that have jumped on that and are trying to make whole new businesses out of this. And so the question more generally about AI is what entire industries are going to change, and are going to change a lot. And is any of that going to benefit us? And so, Sarah, I would like to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. First of all, we should all applaud Danny for that awesome explanation, given that he's a humanist, right? But look at how humanists and social scientists are actually invested in being technologists as well. So how will it change industries? Well, I have to first of all admit that I got out of the business of prognostication when it comes to things like internet technologies and so on, when almost 30 years ago, I saw the World Wide Web for the first time and told a friend of mine who had the browser on a floppy disk and had loaded it on a Mac Quadra, this will never take off. Everyone knows the internet is text-based. So, I say that to stay humble, right, when it comes to prediction, but also because I think it's an actually incredibly resonant way of thinking about computers and what they're actually doing, because what we're talking about right now is LLMs, really the ultimate expression of the internet as text, right? Like just on total steroids. And so in a way, things have sort of come full circle in that regard. This is the question that everyone on Wall Street thinks they can answer, right? Which is, how will these technologies disrupt current industries? And I don't know about you, but I don't love being disrupted as much as like the financial and world and Silicon Valley tech giants think that I think we all do. That tends not to be a vocabulary word that I think of as inherently positive. But that having been said, I'm not a Luddite. I don't inherently hate technology. In fact, I'm really a huge computer nerd. That's why I'm here. That's why my whole life has been about working with and around and about computers. But I do think that one of the important things to do is we listen to those people who make the claims like every single industry will be reconstituted in light of AI technology. I think we actually really need to tune our ears into what is actually being suggested and sold. And so there are some really obvious and exciting applications for neural networks with huge compute power that can do all kinds of things that are just not possible with regard to human capacity for those things. Cancer research is a big area that comes to mind, and using AI to make discoveries in imagery that otherwise wouldn't be possible to process, things like that, things that I think have real social value. But some of the other places in which we hear noise about this disruption and how industries will be reconstituted are really, quite frankly, about cheapening what is already there. And what I hear as somebody who really cares about the intersections of human engagement, particularly in the form of labor and computation, and where those things meet and where they're in both sometimes contention, but also in some kind of symbiosis, is when I hear that AI is going to full scale replace, for example, creative workers, writers, artists, people who work in creative industries in a variety of ways. What I actually hear when I listen in to the language of industry leaders, we could take the writers' strike, for example, as just one recent example of what CEOs and others were saying, is that there's some level of good enough that should be the expectation for the public around things like creative outputs. And I also think Jacob was getting at this a bit too with his comments. And what I hear in that is these companies, which all of which are having record-breaking profits right now, if we were to check their balance sheets, right, always see this one particular line item that they just can't make inroads on in terms of lowering the price. I mean, they've done everything they can. They've outsourced to places in the global south. They've mechanized everything they can. They've cheapened the quality of products, but they still always require some level of human labor. And what the goals are for many of these companies is to take that line item and turn it into a zero, or as close to a zero as they can get. And what that's going to necessitate in industries like the ones I've mentioned that rely on some form of human ingenuity or creativity or input is to not eliminate human workers, but to shift them around in the production chain of where they will actually appear. Ergo, how their contributions will be valued. Who's going to decide on that value? Well, the people who run the companies. So instead of being a copywriter, let's say, who creates original copy and puts that forward for, maybe advertising, as Safia was talking about, maybe that person is no longer generating the content, but they're down the production chain looking to see if what the LLM-based tool came up with is passable as and acceptable as like a human way of communicating, or if in as many cases we've all seen or experienced is really uncanny and weird and has to have human intervention at that point to kind of soften the edges that the computation is just not quite good enough at. And that's kind of a silly example, but when you extrapolate that to more serious cases, right? Like, who cares if the ad sounds natural, right? I mean, we've all encountered these weird turns of phrase and weird stuff online, probably AI generated. But what about when it's a research study and it turns out that all of the citations are fake? I'll give an example there. When I first got onto ChatGPT, I started playing with trying to think of a thing where I would have enough expertise to kind of evaluate what the results were that I got. And so I asked ChatGPT to generate a bibliography for me of work about commercial content moderation of social media, which is my area of expertise. And it immediately, I mean, within a millisecond, started spilling out responses, listing titles, listing journal articles, listing monographs, edited volumes, et cetera. The first one was by a colleague of mine. Yeah, that for sure should be on the list. Second one was an edited volume that I didn't know about, and it was on a reputable press. And I thought, oh my God, this came out during COVID. I guess I was just underground during that period. Third thing that came out was from a colleague of mine at Berkeley who doesn't work in that area at all. I didn't know she had published in that area, but it was in a journal I recognized, gave its page numbers and everything. And as that kept happening, I thought, wait a minute. Let me actually go to this journal and look up these page numbers and see if this is an article that's actually ever been written. Well, guess what? It was a totally bogus article. It had never been written, but it looked convincing. And I realized I hadn't told ChatGPT, generate a bibliography for me of real citations, real valid information. I guess my bad, right? But now extrapolate that to the fact that we know that the basis, the corpus that something like ChatGPT uses is this large language model essentially scraped from the internet. We all know that there's never any BS posted to Reddit, right? Never anything weird that you'll come across in a comment section on some forum. You can 100% bet everything on what that random, poster 715 from wherever said. Now you put that all in the engine, and that's actually what's generating the responses. There's an adage in computer science, is called garbage in, garbage out, right? So what we actually have to think about is not only what the tools are capable of doing, but where are the data from that they're basing their outputs, their decision-making, their results, et cetera on. And I mean, Sophia's gonna have more to say on this, so I'll leave it there. But that's the kind of disruption I'm scared of.
Yeah. Okay. So this means that I really must ask Sophia a question about that. So I like the sentence about that AI enables machines to learn from experience and learn from data. And as you were saying there, it's not going to be any better than the data they're looking on. And we know that data can be biased, and maybe there's a lot of biased data out there. So Sophia, what can you tell us about that?
Well, this is one of those really important moments for us to even start to disambiguate even more with more granularity, even around the concept of bias in computing models. And I say that because more than a decade ago, when I was arguing in my own work that computational models can be biased by a variety of human values, that was like screaming into the void, into a field of computer scientists and computer engineers and information scientists, which is a field I'm in, who were hyper reductionist about talking about artificial intelligence or computation as purely math. And so that's a little bit like, just to kind of pull back, and then I'm going to zoom back in. It's a little bit like asking, our colleagues in biology, what does it mean to be human? And they respond that to be human is to be mitochondria and cells. They're not wrong, but that's not actually the whole story. So I think when we're talking about something now, and again, we used to have, not that long ago, a hyper reductionist way of talking about AI and computation as purely math. And then, some of us kind of broke through that paradigm and said, no, actually the math is full of judgment. It's assessing human conditions. Data is actually representative of a variety of social practices, political practices, economic, in human endeavors. It's representative of very complex social phenomena, which means even the word data now has to be unpacked. Maybe it's not a useful word in some contexts. So yes, of course, there has always been bias in data. I think we should not assume that there is some null state where there is no bias or there is an unbiased ideal that we are striving for. In fact, what we should talk about when we talk about things like bias is now in these models is, what does it mean that we take the human condition, all kinds of social and human practices, political practices, histories, and we we flatten them and reduce them into categories that can then be assessed, standardized in some ways, and read out as kind of like a neutral endeavor. And I'll give you one of the best examples that comes right here from UCLA. One of our colleagues in anthropology developed a technology called Predpol. And Predpol was a technology that was sold to law enforcement around the United States and beyond, that was designed to predict where criminal activity might take place in a city. And it was sold to law enforcement. Now, this on its face is kind of like, as Sarah said, garbage in, garbage out. It's like, well, you take arrest data by zip code, you take reports, calls to 911 by zip code. You know, you can take like a dozen factors and put that into a computational model. And the truth is, it will actually give you a highly probabilistic result of where to look in the city in Los Angeles for crime to be taking place. But of course, what it won't do is it won't account for economic and racial segregation. It won't account for communities and neighborhoods in Los Angeles that have been over-policed historically. It will not look at particular types of crime, like white-collar crime or other kinds of crime that are happening, in fact, all over the city, and maybe in more affluent neighborhoods, some types of crimes. It will just flatten all of these kinds of inputs and then give us, you know, an output. And what that will result in is more police, more danger, more threat to life in communities that are already under those kinds of threats. So I think these kinds of like racist profiling models have now become ubiquitous in all kinds of industries. So you have predictive models that get used to determine who gets a mortgage, who gets to rent housing, who has their children taken from them by a foster care system, who gets the COVID-19 vaccine first. I mean, we could actually go on and on and on with who gets into college. The use of predictive models and the kind of taking in of all kinds of data or social phenomena into systems, and the flattening of the nuances of that, and then the turning out of a set of recommendations that business leaders, that school boards, that employers in particular, and other decision makers, financial services, insurance companies, I could go on, use, means that we are again interacting with what seemingly benign artificial intelligence, the banal. I told you I studied the basic and banal, the less interesting, because I believe that those are the most impactful ways that we are engaging with systems that can be incredibly harmful and perpetuate all of the worst of the past directly into the future. And I'll give you one more quick example. During COVID, Apple released its credit card. And many of you here, I know for sure, my panelists, but others as well, remember that all of the women who were getting these Apple credit cards were getting like 1/10 of the credit that their husbands were getting. And I remember the inventor of Ruby on Rails in particular was Steve Wozinski as well. I mean, like, if you couldn't believe it, like the tech company leaders, their wives are being gender discriminated against. And no one can understand what's happening. And they're calling customer service reps who are saying, I don't know, the algorithm said, that this is just what it is. Well, when NPR contacted me to speak on it, it was really obvious. I said, well, my own mother couldn't get a bank account without her father or her husband co-signing on that account in the 1980s. So if women don't have a long history of credit because of gender discrimination in the United States, and that information is brought into a model where you're going to see that men have X times the length of credit history and other kinds of predictors, irrespective of women's creditworthiness. And so these are the kinds of things that have become very, very difficult to unpack because the technology or the AI obfuscates the historical and contemporary racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination.
So now we are really getting to sort of the personal aspect of AI, of going to the bank and asking for a loan and maybe not getting it because of the algorithm. So I want to ask a question about this thing about how AI touches us either today or very soon. So when do we encounter AI other than the list you already gave? When do we see it, and how does it affect us already today? Danny, I'm looking at you, but what do you think?
I think that's I think I think my response probably rhymes with Safia's. I think that we encounter it much more pervasively than we would like to imagine. I think every time that we open up Spotify to play a song, we encounter an advanced AI. Every time that we open up a YouTube playlist, there's an AI generating that. There are editorial algorithmic processes that determine effectively everything that we encounter when we open up these little boxes, these little screens that we're all staring at right now. I think there's very little of what's going on here, including, I don't know, the noise cancellation algorithm that's making my voice come to you right now. That they are pervasive, and I think that they're only growing more pervasive. And I think some of the new forms, I think one of the things that's bringing this into the public attention or the public eye in a way that hadn't before is that some of the invisible processes, predictive policing, fintech, medical tech, things that are relatively invisible, especially for the more privileged users, those are being supplemented or being supplanted by attention to much more visible actions like ChatGPT or image generators or AI films. Like, it's easier to like place an AI there, when in fact I think that they're invisible and they're pervasive, and they're impacting our lives, our moods, the way that we're attached to things, really at a moment to moment basis whenever we're in front of one of these screens, and even when we're not in front of them.
Jacob, do you have some examples to add? So the example is growing pretty long here, but do you have more places?
I guess more. Yeah, I guess more what I would add is a sort of deflationary note that, I mean, there has also been a certain amount of what you might call conceptual creep or marketing inflation, where, you know, something that would have been data analytics from 15 years ago and data science from 8 years ago is now AI. But, you know, in lots of cases, the underlying technology, or at least the underlying ideas, haven't changed radically. So, I mean, in some sense, a lot of what folks might be trying to sell to us as AI, we've been exposed to for a long time, in all sorts of ways. And, you know, one of the things, so I mean, an example that you know, I've heard about recently is some fairly serious interest in using large language models, to which, you know, I would say is moving more into the domain where I would feel more comfortable, where I think there is something genuinely interesting and new and distinctive that's going on. Sarah mentioned earlier, you know, all of this image recognition stuff, that there has been a change in those capacities over the past, you know, 15 years. But you know, using large language models to automatically populate, you know, physicians' notes in electronic health records. You know, I know it's very hard to be a physician and make good notes, but, you know, I sure don't think it's a good idea that will lead to improved patient care, to have those be, you know, crapped out by a language model that is probably going to be inserting all sorts of assumptions about you based on details about people who are kind of like you in various ways. And, you know, more generally, I think that is a use case that falls into the domain of what, you know, my friend Melanie Mitchell earlier today, actually at a meeting on AI at the Global Flourishing Conference, said was essentially using AI technologies to try to prop up fundamentally shitty, if you'll excuse me, and broken human systems. Yes. And I think that is a very pernicious usage that we're going to be seeing more and more of, in the spirit of what Sarah was talking about with, like, you know, reducing the cost of different lineup, you know, trying to prop those things up, where what we really should be doing is deeply rethinking them. But instead, what we're doing is patching more and more AI onto them to try to keep this bad thing going.
So I'm still sitting here and thinking about that the next time I go to the bank, I cannot get a loan. So I have to ask this question about, should the government do anything? And I actually personally think the government should do something. And so there's this question of, what can the government do to prevent AI from doing harm? And so, Sophia, I know that that there was this whole President Biden's executive order a month ago, and I know you know a lot about it. Could you tell us, what is it the government is trying to do there? Sophia, I'm pretty sure that you are muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I see Professor Roberts was trying to jump in on that. I don't know.
We queue her up for next.
Okay, great. Well, you know, I think it's kind of an incredible moment. I mean, I have to say that I know Professor Roberts knows that it's just stunning to see a US president sign an executive order that foregrounds the concerns of workers with respect to technology, that says to see the Vice President of the United States deliver keynote addresses in Europe, you know, on the heels of the executive order the same week, that racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination cannot be tolerated in the, you know, adoption and widespread use of AI. I mean, these are words that are our words, quite frankly, and there are words showing up in these kinds of, you know, 100+ page orders that are trying to scope, you know, a framework that is counter in some ways to the framework and agenda that has been set by the tech industry for 40 years in the United States. And so I think while there are many limits to the executive order, especially around enforcement and the ability to implement, I think we should be, you know, we should not lose sight that of the Herculean feat that is taken to get governments around the world to prioritize people and workers and civil rights and human rights with respect to AI. I mean, this is an extraordinary breakthrough, in my opinion. And of course, I do see the limits. I was heartened to be invited to the White House to witness the signing of the executive order, and you know, knowing that I, in many ways, was representing many of my colleagues who are who have pushed the limits, and as I've kind of already mentioned previously in my comments. So I think, you know, there's a lot of possibilities here. I mean, right before the executive order was signed, President Biden opened his remarks with talking about the contract that had been negotiated by the United Auto Workers, which I think is very important, because at the heart of so many of these conversations about the future and the moment, the contemporary moment, not 1,000 years from now, but like this week, about AI, are concerns about the rights of workers, the rights of students, the right of patients, you know, the rights of consumers, to be protected from, as you know, Jacob, I'm going to use my words to describe what I heard you say, which is, you know, a lot of snake oil that's out here in the industry, kind of passing itself off as one thing when it's actually quite in fact something else. And so I think, you know, this is an interesting moment. The executive order stresses that all of the federal agencies over the next 180 days start working on implementation. And it also calls for greater authority to regulatory agencies. Now, this is really important because we have agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, of course, Chair Lena Khan, who is a formidable foe to the tech industry and is a law professor and a person who understands the danger of monopolies. She's actually written a canonical work around the threat that Amazon as a monopoly is to small businesses and to the public at large. So we have a lot of possible threads to pull on to try to kind of unravel this sweater, if you will. I don't know why that's become my recent metaphor of choice, but I just find that, you know, we need to get very serious very quickly. And I should just add that if we're worried today, well, you know, we won't be sleeping a year from now when AI and propaganda have completely taken over electoral politics and the way in which we do democracy in Western liberal democracies. We've already seen the threats of that starting as far back as 2016, 2015, 2014. And mind you, I will just have you recall that the way we even came to understand the role that bots were playing in other kinds of what we call foreign interference in US elections was at the expense of people pretending to be Black Lives Matter activists, pretending to be Black women on the internet, pretending to be civil rights activists, and whipping up the domestic threat of white nationalists who, who organized to the point of an attempted coup d'etat, a coup against the United States government. I mean, if we think that isn't something to be, I'm laughing as a defense mechanism right now, but I will tell you, I don't sleep at night when I think about the real consequences. They are at this level of how the public will feel. Major political shifts, major economic shifts, if we don't look to some of the ideas in the executive order and put significantly more pressure on state and federal government.
Sarah, you want to add something here?
Well, yeah, I first of all, I couldn't agree more with what Safiya has just said and about the stakes. And I want to go back to something that I think Jacob was gesturing at, which is the way in which this notion of AI is being used without precision. There's a lack of disambiguation about what's actually being affected by AI and what is, as Safiya said, snake oil. And those distinctions are not inconsequential by any means, right? So on the one hand, we have yet another example that I just read about in the past week of a supposed startup that was curating basically high-end clients' potential shopping lists. So if you're on Instagram, like I unfortunately am, and I know Dr. Noble's on there too, they do a great job of targeting me for things I might want to buy. I mean, kudos to them because they've got my taste dialed in. So this was a startup company that claimed that it would do that, but for, really A-list clients, hyper rich people, exclusivity, et cetera. And it was going to use its predictive AI tools, to source these things for these individuals and use their likes and preferences and so on to kind of curate this. Well, what it turned out to be was a bunch of low-paid workers in a sweatshop scouring the web for that information and generating lists that they thought would appeal to those people based on publicly available information, right? So on the one hand, we have that kind of snake oil that is the kind of stuff that I think people experience, through apps or through Instagram, other kinds of tools we already know. But as Safia said, it's the banal, it's the everyday. It's the example Jacob gave of your medical notes being written full scale by computation, and then you having no recourse when you've been inappropriately diagnosed with a condition and now you're uninsurable, or you are put on a list for reasons that you can't even access because of this kind of black box technology that often the companies themselves have no mechanism or recourse to have redress, right? And again, we know that that's going to disproportionately affect people who are already disproportionately affected by inequities in society. The question that I think we have to ask about these kinds of tools is who controls them, right? What are their motives in controlling them? Are they interested, as so many Silicon Valley founders used to say, in making the world a better place? Or are they solely interested in increasing the bottom line by denying insurance claims, keeping neighborhoods at high property values, digital redlining, a practice that was outlawed 40 years ago and is back. It's back because the computer generated it. Somehow that makes it okay or better. So I think one thing that I want people to do, or I hope they feel empowered to do after leaving this conversation, is to use their own wits and their own very real human intelligence, nothing artificial about it, your intelligence that a computer wishes it had, right? To analyze claims, to ask questions like, well, why are we in a situation where tech has been calling the shots for 40 years? I had a student of mine raise her hand one day in class and say, well, where's the FTC in all of this? A+, right? 20-year-old student asking the tough questions, right? We know these industries are not going to self-regulate. Chevy did not come to Congress and say, gosh, we're so sorry about all the people that are being killed in the Corvair. Ralph Nader came and said it's unsafe at any speed, right? They didn't just voluntarily put the seatbelts in. The tobacco industry didn't voluntarily restrain itself. The allure of the possibilities of making money off of all of our well-being, individually and collectively, is too great. They won't do it. So we have to implore our elected leaders to have a backbone and stand up to some of these people. And as Safia said, 15 years ago, she and I were both being told that we were all wrong and that computers didn't, computer code couldn't be used in a political or in a antisocial kind of fashion or in a way to harm. I mean, where does the computer industry, the modern computer industry, come from in the United States? It comes from waging war. So we know that's just bogus. And so I think we have to use our capacities that we all already have to really critically evaluate some of these claims and ask these hard questions and have fun, play with ChatGPT, play with some of these tools. We didn't even get to talk about the environmental impact of these things tonight, which Safia knows. She'll drop data nuggets on me from time to time, and I really have to curl up in a dark room because it's so disturbing. I told her, oh, did you know that the average car puts 4 tons of carbon emissions into the atmosphere every year? And she said, you want to know how much a large language model generates? And Safia, you want to tell us?
668,000 cubic tons in one 24-hour model run. So
Yeah.
that's the lifetime of 52 cars
One
for
day.
one 24-hour
cycle.
I mean, that is it, that we would divorce our fascination with AI from those kinds of very real threats is stunning to me. And yet, especially in the academy, we have this desire to deeply compartmentalize. And, this is one of our own, I think, failings in our fields and in academia, is that we have this knowledge and we can't quite figure out how to integrate that knowledge across domains. I know Jeff is just like, why am I on this panel? But keep looking at you, Jeff, because I know you're doing such innovative and interesting things.
Oh, I don't mind. I think this is, I mean, this seems like the most fundamental conversation to have. I guess the thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking was something Danny mentioned at the very beginning about this idea of advanced probes, and to some extent, I think one function for the university, and I'll have to think about whether this is compartmentalizing or not, is sort of looking at how to build alternatives. And so if there's a sort of strong push for regulation and control over the industry direction, I think there's also a need and an opening to demonstrate alternatives that come from different sort of ways of knowing and ways of working, sort of alternative trajectories, that are providing, I think, some things for, at least I think of, for example, computer science students, engineering students, the people who go out into these fields, and their colleagues from data science and elsewhere to like go out with an alternative model of the relationship between these technologies and the world and the data that they rely on and the people they interact with. And so I think that was, I enjoy hearing these concerns because they're so pressing, and it's kind of useful to be reminded of that. And I guess my rhetorical question at this point, given the timing, is just how do those concerns also channel into the practicalities of demonstrating alternatives, and is that something that we should be involved in at the university? What does that look like? And so I'll leave it at that, since this was sort of just a comment injected, but thanks.
That's great. I think I'll do a round of 2-minute answers here at the end. I want to ask the big question of what gives you hope for this whole AI inflicting something on all of us? What keeps you up at night? And what do you want people to do out there behind the screen? So Jeff, you're already speaking. You can continue. What do you think?
I think the things that keep other people up at night are I have the same, right? I think those concerns are really pressing and a little bit scary. I think I don't know if it gives me hope, but definitely like a direction of interest it is on how that attention can point us back to our sort of how we think about the data around us and the data in at our scale, and sort of the challenge that exists for the technical community and the users of AI to help us like deal with small data, think about our specific context and our lives and our interactions and things under our control in new ways, rather than sort of focusing on what can be deployed at massive scale, focusing only on sort of massive scale. And I think there's some interesting work that's happening, both technical and artistic, and in sort of the critique of these technologies that may drive some interesting things there. So I'm slightly hopeful, although there are these really pressing concerns that exist as well.
Very good, very good. Jacob, same question. What gives you hope and what keeps you up at night, and what do you want people to do?
Well, for me, all of those things are kind of entangled. I mean, I guess what I would say, I'll start by saying what keeps me up at night, on top of the things that, as Jeff said, I think are common to all of us. Thank you for reminding us about the what is going to happen in a year, Sophia. That's very exciting. Really needed that reminder before bedtime. I think for me, one of the things I really worry about is that we don't find a way out of the current technical paradigm behind artificial intelligence. In other words, that we're stuck with basically some version of deep learning, scaling massive data, blah, blah, blah. And like that is the paradigm, not because it's not theoretically possible, but simply because for the kinds of interests that are driving the research direction, that's adequate. And I say this both because I think that current paradigm, as amazing as it is in many ways, also has these very deep environmental harms, these very deep social harms. It's also, as a scientist, kind of uninteresting in the sense that, like, what's next? What's the next paradigm? I mean, I think everyone who works in these sorts of domains hopes not to be sort of left filling in the details of ideas that folks before them, worked out, or even worse, just like coming up with better engineering solution. I mean, as important as that is, but like coming up with better engineering solutions to these sort of basic problems. So my hope is, look, I mean, we have existence proofs, like right in here, of technologies that are massively more energy efficient, massively more data efficient. It is that are able to work, as Jeff was saying, with small data, with local contexts. It can be done. The laws of nature seem to permit it. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that we can come up with, as a scientist, like, I'm excited by that. I think it would be wonderful. That's what I hope we can do. And what you all should do, along with putting on your kind of critical spectacles at all times, is, do some advocacy in terms of, what the government is doing, the federal government is doing, both in regulating artificial intelligence and in funding artificial intelligence. Frankly, the scale of NSF and, DOE and DOD and whatever investment in AI is minuscule compared to the money tech companies are spending. And so if I were in charge of that purse, I would want that to be spent exploring much wider sets of AI and even computing paradigms than are currently being explored.
Very good. Sophia, what about you? Hopes, and what keeps you up at night, and what should people do?
Well, I feel very hopeful. I mean, I used to just have my head to the desk all the time having these conversations, and now, we can all get in on it. And I feel like, I know the thousands of graduate students and even more undergraduates who want to study at the intersection of technology and society. The stats students want to take the classes about sociology and society, and all these different kinds of intersections now are legible. We can grab a hold of them. Unfortunately, that's just because we have more evidence of harm, but nonetheless, you cannot solve problems that you cannot name and that you can't recognize. So we are in a very powerful moment of inquiry, and I feel extremely hopeful about that. What keeps me up at night is that we are spending our life force, responding to the whims of billionaires. And that seems like, well, I tell my students, if I didn't have to work on issues of structural racism and inequality in tech, I would probably try to write books about the world's best swim up bars. I don't know. I would just not be doing this. I would have the possibility of dreaming up other kinds of, I'm just joking, but I would not think of myself as a state employee working on cleaning up the messes of people who have no regard for the rest of us. And so I think that that does keep me up at night, because we are living at a time where the UC funding is drawing up. We live in the richest state, in the nation. I mean, I think we have like the 6th or 7th largest GDP in the world because of Hollywood and the tech sector and agribusiness. And we have, in essence, defunded education completely, and higher education in particular in the UC. That definitely keeps me up at night, because I spend most of my time trying to raise money from foundations just to pay for graduate students to get an education to help us work on, these challenges. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm worried about the prioritization, the lack of taxpayer dollars you know, going into the solutions, the way that the tech industry offshores all of its money and its profits, and is subsidized by, you know, the rest of us. And you know, I feel hopeful that the more we talk about that, the more we might be able to shift that too.
Yeah. Sarah, same question for you.
Well, I echo this issue of trying to, you know, the kind of irony of being in this cycle of needing to go solicit funds, you know, sort of prostrate ourselves before the big philanthropic organizations founded by the robber barons of the Gilded Age. I mean, like the you know, the irony isn't lost on any of us who are in those relationships. I mean, thank God the Mellons and the Ford Foundations of the world are interested to a certain extent in these issues as well. But yet and still, you know, the thing that Safi and I were literally talking about the issue of you know, the defunding of public education, K-12 through higher education just earlier today and last night. So thanks for letting me go to bed on that too, Safia. But you know, the point that I would make too is that these tech companies are trading on technologies that were invented at places like UCLA using public funding and public resources, and yet they've never in any capacity, even close to adequately given back for those kinds of public goods that they have been able to capitalize upon and to commercialize and to privatize. So, you know, that keeps me up at night. Obviously, you know, the threats to democracy are a thing that bother me too and stress me out a lot. And I have a great therapist, and I recommend that to everyone on the panel if you don't have one, because we like know a lot, right, about the ills. But I think the things that give me light and give me hope are things like my students who at 20 years old, after 6 weeks of a 10-week course talking about these issues, say things like, where's the FTC on this? Or who say things like, gosh, this just seems like colonialism all over again, as I talk about the way in which companies like Meta and Google and others outsource their very real need for material human labor to places like the Philippines. That was a place the United States occupied for years. So the young people are making connections that have been deliberately obfuscated by those in power. You know, I go back to the example of the doctor's notes. Why do we need AI for doctors' you know, clinical notes? Well, we know that doctors have less than 15 minutes to see a patient. They don't have time. So why is the problem we need to speed up their ability to make doctor's notes? Isn't the problem that we're asking doctors to spend 15 minutes with a patient in a privatized healthcare system that doesn't acknowledge the needs of people like us who might be ill? I mean, so one thing that I think we can all do as well is ask the right questions, because right now, even when there's a response, and I think Safia was gesturing at this, we're responding to tech's agenda, right? We're always in this reactive mode to their agenda. And even if it's just to say, no, we don't want that. And so I'm hopeful that with a new generation of young people, to whom I deeply apologize, because Gen X thought we were going to solve some things. We're not doing it. We're too small of a generation. I don't know. We tried. We're still trying. But, you know, to the millennials and the Gen Zs and those coming up, I mean, they give me hope, because I think they're not going to take that.
No.
I think they're not going to take that.
Yep. I think hope has it so far. But Danny, please. Same question for you.
Sure, I've got so many new nightmares to have. I feel like I've got rounding us out, I've got a whole bevy of new nightmares to keep me up tonight. Most presently, I'm thinking about terminology and how, you know, AI has always been, I agree, you know, with my colleagues here, that a kind of marketing term that has subsumed all these other things into this one marketing term. AI subsumed big data, machine learning, all these things, you know, one after the next, all toward the consolidation of power in the hands of, you know, literally a handful of humans, which is one nightmare I have. But it's easy for me to have an apocalyptic imaginary. I was raised that way, and so I'm going to put my eschatological nightmares aside. I am, of course, afraid that these developments are all just moving so fast that the nightmares proliferate. I mean, more quickly than these brilliant colleagues of mine and myself can articulate them. I think they just keep popping up. So I won't linger with that as our final note. By contrast, I thought maybe to build a little bit on what Jeff and Sophia were saying, I think the speculative imaginaries that I find in the classroom give me the most hope. I find these little glimmers of hope in every one of the little art projects and critiques that my students produce in my classrooms. Their willingness really to engage with this horrifying and scary, like uncertain and deeply troubling future, to face that head on with wit and creativity, and often no small dose of their own, albeit naive, hope for the future is a continuous source of inspiration. So, selfishly, as a kind of buttress against my own nightmares, I have my students there generating little engines of hope for me, and I think maybe that's probably a good point for me to
wonderful.
conclude.
Okay, let me just give my thanks to all of you panelists. It's been wonderful. I have a whole stack of quotes that are going straight into my quote file after this, and so thank you all.
I'd just like to say, wow, a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Jens Paulsberg for so capably moderating this discussion, and to Jeff Burke, Dr. Jacob Foster, Dr. Sophia Noble, Dr. Sarah T. Roberts, and Dr. Danny Snelson for your time and for enlightening us on how our lives will be enhanced and challenged with the expansion of artificial intelligence. Thank you as well to Women in Philanthropy members and other UCLA supporters for participating in our webinar. And also tremendous appreciation to Kelly Angaro and Eduardo Ponce from the development events team for helping with all of the Zoom meeting logistics. We will be hosting webinars and in-person programs after the new year. So look for invitations to other interesting programs from Women and Philanthropy. Thank you so much for joining us, and this concludes our event. Have a good evening.